In the last section, we defined a connect function inside of our song list component. So remember, this connect thing right here, even though it doesn't really look like it, is actually a React component. It's a React component that we're going to pass some configuration to. We're going to specifically tell this connect thing that we want to get a list of songs out of our Redux store from the provider. So anytime that our list of songs inside of our store changes, the provider is going to automatically notify our connect function right here. And the connect function is then going to pass our list of songs down to our song list component. So let's now figure out how we can configure this connect function or connect component and tell it that we want to get some specific data out of our Redux store. All right, so to do so, I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to define a function right above our export default statement. Now by convention, this is convention, we normally call this function the map state to props function. Oops, like so. Now this can be an arrow function, it could be a function keyword. You will see it defined both ways, map state to props. So this is a very crazy little function name, but if you really kind of read it, it will eventually start to make a little bit more sense. This is saying that we're going to take our state object, essentially all of the data that's inside of our Redux store, and we're going to run some calculation on it or some computation that's going to cause that data to eventually show up as props inside of our component. So that's the meaning of map state to props. This function does not have to be called map state to props. We could just as easily call it get my state, like so. We can call it anything we want, but by convention, you're usually going to see this defined as something called map state to props. This map state to props function is going to be called with all of the state inside of our Redux store. So that state right there is essentially going to be our entire list of songs from the song list reducer and our currently selected song from the selected song reducer. So state right here, all of the data inside of our Redux store. If we were still working on that insurance application, the state object right here would contain our accounts and our policies and our claims history properties as well. So then for right now, let's try just console logging that thing out. I'm going to say console log state. And then after that, I'm going to say return state, just to make sure that everything works just fine. Now, after defining that function, I'm then going to take it and pass it as the first argument to this connect function down here. So that's how we configure this connect component. I've said several times, oh yeah, we need to configure connect in some way and tell it how to get some data from provider. We configure it by passing it a function. So I'm going to pass that as the first function to connect, map state to props. Now again, I want to remind you, we can call this anything we want to call it. So we could call it get my state if we want to. Nothing special about calling it map state to props. All right, so let's save this. We're going to run it and see what happens. All right, so I'm going to flip back over. And you'll immediately notice that we've got our state object printed out right here. We've got selected song that has all the data that was returned from our selected song reducer, which by default was null. And then we've got the songs array as well that has those 4 song objects that we had defined. So now we essentially want to pull off just this songs property and make sure that it somehow gets into our song list component. Remember, the song list component doesn't care about the selected song at all. It just cares about songs. So to do so, inside of my map state to props function right here, I'm going to remove that console log, and I'm going to remove the state right there, and I'm going to replace it with an object. This object is going to have a key of songs, and its value will be state.songs, like so. So the object that we return from the map state to props function is going to show up as props inside of our component. So we're essentially saying by returning this object right here, we're essentially saying that at some point in time in the future, inside of our song list component, if we say this.props, it's going to be equal to exactly that object right there. It's going to be an object that has a songs property, and that will contain the list or the array of all of our songs. So that is exactly how we make use of the React Redux library to get data from our Redux store into a component. It's always going to be the exact same scenario. We're always going to import connect at the top. We're always going to call connect and then pass in our component as the second function call, we're always going to define map state to props. Map state to props is always going to get a first argument of state, and we're always going to return an object that is going to show up as props inside of our component. Now, if any of that seemed mysterious, then just do a quick replay of those last 15 seconds, or if you missed anything in there, do a replay of those last 15 seconds. Because that entire flow that I just mentioned is going to be repeated a billion times on every single React project that you ever work on. It's always going to be the same code that you see inside of here over and over and over again. Always import connect, always the component, always map state to props, and then always export default connect your component right there. All right, so without further ado, inside of my component, I'm going to try doing a console log of this .props, like so. Let's just see what data shows up inside that component. So I'll flip back over, and now here's my props object. I see my list of songs. There's the list of songs right there. And then you'll notice that we also got a reference to the dispatch function from our Redux store as well. This is the same dispatch function that we used previously inside of CodePen to manually dispatch an action creator, or manually dispatch an action after calling an action creator. So if we ever want to change some data inside of our application, we can make use of this dispatch function right here, but as you'll see in just a little bit, there's a much more convenient way of doing that. All right, so now that we've got our list of songs inside of here, let's take a pause. When we come back in the next section, we're going to render this list of songs out inside of our song list component. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.